In this video, we're going to talk about the nature of variables. As you recall, variables are indicators of characteristics or attributes that the researchers are interested in learning more about. And depending on the purpose of the study, the researcher may measure or actually manipulate a variable to better understand the characteristic of interest and how it relates to some important outcome. And these characteristics are central to the purpose and the specific research questions under investigation. How researchers conceptualize variables will shape how they choose to conduct data collection and analysis. So we're going to look at variables through two lenses. So of course, one way to think about variables is to consider their scale of measurement, or the types of scores that the researcher collected. And the level of measurement constrains what techniques are available to the researcher when they move on to summarizing and testing theories with the data. So this information is crucial to evaluating whether or not there was a good fit between the methodology used and the research questions and purpose. Now, Plato, Clark, and Creswell discuss how to describe a variable's scale of measurement in terms of whether or not the variable is categorical or continuous. One place where Bernard and Abrami go a bit further than your textbook is by making a distinction between interval and ratio levels of measurement. So continuous variables can be measured on these different scales of measurement, and the key distinction between them is whether or not the zero is arbitrary or meaningful. So an example that is used in education is the IQ test. Now, this must be an interval scale of measurement because there isn't really a meaningful 0 point for IQ. And when you compare scores on IQ tests, you can discuss them as being more or less or equal, but you can't really say that someone with a score of 140 is twice as intelligent as someone who scores a 70. So in contrast, ratio data can be described in terms of multiplication and division, or in terms of ratios. So you can say that the person who read for 2 hours read twice as long as the person who read for 1 hour. In both cases, the interval between possible scores is always equal, but there are some limitations to what you can do with interval data that do not apply to ratio data. For the most part, though, in statistics, interval and ratio data are treated pretty much the same way. And we're going to look more at that topic, how the scale of measurement constrains types of description and inference that the researcher can use to describe the data they collect in week 6. So the second really important way to view variables is the lens of theory. And when we discuss variables using this lens, we are talking about the function that is ascribed to a particular variable within a study. Now you remember that quantitative researchers are often interested in studying relationships between variables. Ideally, they would like to identify cause and effect relationships. So what they do is design research studies that control outside influences on the variables of interest so that they can make a strong argument that the data they have is consistent with a cause and effect relationship that they suspect does exist. So let's review the vocabulary associated with this theoretical perspective on variables. The variables that take center stage in a quantitative study are the independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are factors that the researcher expects to have some influence on the dependent variable, which is the outcome of interest. Depending on the type of research design used, you may see independent variables referred to by different names. In non-intervention research designs, such as correlational studies, you may be more likely to see dependent variables referred to as measured variables or predictor variables. In an intervention study, such as an evaluation of a new pedagogical technique, you might see the independent variable referred to as a manipulated variable or a treatment variable. And that makes sense because the researchers are intentionally changing the conditions of learning in an intervention study. So this is a manipulation. For example, they might manipulate the hours of homework assigned or apply a treatment to one group and not another, such as a remedial lesson plan for a particular group of students. A control variable is another important type of variable, and this is simply a factor that the researcher has good reason to believe also influences the dependent variable, but this factor, for whatever reason, isn't just not the subject of interest in this study. So they aim to measure it so that they can account for its influence on the dependent variable and ideally isolate the influence of the independent variable of interest. So for example, I might be looking at the influence of a breakfast program for children on their behaviors in class. And my theory is that if children eat breakfast in the morning, they will be observed showing more on-task behavior in class than if they are hungry. Of course, I know that kids naturally vary in how much they pay attention in class, so I may wish to, through my design, control for the level of on-task behavior they showed before we initiated the breakfast program. Another important variable of interest from the theoretical perspective is the confounding variable. And the confounding variable is some characteristic that might have influenced the dependent variable, or perhaps the relationship between the independent and dependent variables, but for some reason the researcher did not or could not measure it. They may not have measured it because they were unaware that it was a variable of importance in that context, or of course it may simply be something that is impossible to separate from the other measures. The researcher should ideally report this or acknowledge these confounding variables that they are aware of in the limitation section of their report. And these often provide opportunities for further research. Confounding comes up a lot in educational technology research, and the reason is that there are many moving parts in an instructional setting. For example, it's often difficult to separate the enthusiasm of the professor from their effectiveness in implementing a new active learning approach. So in this scenario, active learning is the independent variable or a treatment variable of interest. My theory is that using active learning techniques will influence two dependent variables or outcome variables of interest, student engagement and student satisfaction. And my hypothesis about the relationship between those variables is that when I compare one class where I use more active learning techniques with another class where I have used fewer techniques, the active learning class will report higher engagement and student satisfaction. Characteristics of the instructor are often tightly integrated with the pedagogical techniques they use. So this is an example of a confound that you may encounter as a limitation in studies again and again. The last key distinction in terms of vocabulary that I would like to address in this video is the distinction between the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Now, when a researcher intends to test a prediction about the relationship between two variables based on theory, they will often use the null hypothesis that there is no difference between variable A and variable B, or there is no difference between group A and group B. And the alternative hypothesis represents the situation that aligns with their prediction, that there is a difference or a relationship between variables A and B, and that it is detectable within the current study. So the researcher's aim is to demonstrate with a certain level of confidence that the data is most consistent with their own prediction, the alternative hypothesis, rather than sort of the default state where we might assume that there is really no meaningful difference between group A and group B in terms of the dependent variable interest. So that covers it for the key vocabulary terms related to variables in quantitative research. I hope you enjoyed this video.